Benny Andersson has been a music legend for decades. As one of the masterminds behind ABBA, he gave the world songs that still make people sing and dance today.
He co-wrote some of the most joyful pop songs ever recorded, songs that filled dance floors on every continent for 50 years. Yet for most of his life, the man behind those melodies stood just outside the spotlight, watching two singers and a songwriting partner take the bows while he stayed at the piano. This is the story of Benny Andersson, the quiet composer whose fingerprints are on almost every note ABBA ever released, and whose own life carried far more struggle, discipline, and reinvention than the glittering image of the band ever let on. Goran Breer Benny Andersson was born on the 16th of December, 1946, in the Vasasten district of Stockholm. His father, Gosta, worked as a civil engineer, and his mother, Layla, kept the household running. 2 years later, his sister Eva-Lise was born, and the family settled into an ordinary, modest Swedish life. What made the Andersson home unusual was the music that filled it. Both Benny's father and his grandfather, Ephraim, were accordion players, and the instrument was almost always present at family gatherings. When Benny turned 6, his parents bought him his own accordion, and that small decision would end up shaping the sound of pop music for the rest of the century. Through his father and grandfather, young Benny absorbed Swedish folk tunes, traditional dance music, and the popular Schlager style that dominated Scandinavian radio at the time. He has said that among the first records he ever owned were an Italian Schlager tune and an Elvis Presley single, and that the mix of styles he heard as a child never really left him. By the time he was 10, he had also gotten his hands on a piano, and rather than take formal lessons, he taught himself. He tried a lesson or two, by his own account, and found them dull. For Benny, music needed to be enjoyable first, technical second, and that self-taught, trial-and-error instinct became the foundation of everything he wrote afterward. School held little interest for him. At 15, he left it behind and started performing in youth clubs around Stockholm, chasing the freedom of making his own money and playing his own music. It was around this time that he met Christina Granville, his first serious girlfriend, with whom he would go on to have 2 children, Peter, born in 1963, and Helene, born in 1965. Benny was still a teenager himself, already juggling fatherhood, work, and an increasingly serious pursuit of music, and the pressure of those early responsibilities would quietly shape his famously disciplined, work-first approach to life. His first real band was Elverkit Spelmanslag, a group built around instrumental pop with a playful edge. It gave him a place to experiment, but the real turning point came when he was invited to join a much bigger outfit, the Hep Stars. Stepping in as the keyboardist, Benny found himself swept into one of the biggest pop sensations Sweden had ever produced. In the spring of 1965, the group scored a massive hit with Cadillac, and almost overnight the Hep Stars became known as Sweden's answer to the Beatles. Benny was no longer just a backing musician. He became a teen idol in his own right, mobbed by fans, and increasingly recognized as the band's creative engine. He began writing original songs for the group, including Sunny Girl and Wedding, tracks that hinted at a melodic sophistication well beyond typical teen pop. Even in his late teens, Benny was chasing something more than a hit single. He wanted melodies that carried real feeling, and he would rework arrangements again and again until they did. The single event that changed the course of his life happened in June of 1966. Touring with the Hep Stars, Benny crossed paths with Bjorn Ulvaeus, a member of the folk group the Hootenanny Singers. The two hit it off immediately, and within a short time, they had written their first song together, Isn't It Easy to Say, which was recorded by the Hep Stars. It wasn't a hit, but it planted the seed for one of the most successful songwriting partnerships in pop history. Bjorn had a gift for lyrics, structure, and language. Benny had an instinct for melody, harmony, and arrangement. Together, their strengths fit almost perfectly, and the partnership between them would end up outlasting the band that made them famous, continuing all the way to today through musicals, orchestral projects, and the ABBA Voyage concert experience. In 1969, both men's personal lives took a turn that would eventually reshape their careers. Benny met Annie Frid Lyngstad, known to fans as Frida, a singer who had already built a career of her own on the Swedish cabaret and television circuit. Around the same period, Bjorn met Agnetha Faltskog, a rising solo star with a distinctive, crystalline voice. As the two couples grew closer personally, they also began working together musically, with Frida and Agnetha lending backing vocals to Bjorn and Benny's early recordings. What started as two separate relationships slowly turned into a shared creative project. Nobody involved seemed to fully realize it yet, but the four of them were assembling the pieces of what would become ABBA. Their early performances together were modest, sometimes rough, and far from an instant sensation. Under a temporary group name, they tried out original songs and toured small venues, refining a group chemistry that took time to click. In 1972, they released a song credited to all four of their name, S, and it did well enough in Sweden, even making a brief showing overseas, to convince them they might have something special. The following year, they entered Sweden's National Song Contest with an entry that ultimately placed only third, but the song still became a European hit, proving there was an audience for their sound beyond the contest itself. It was around this point that their manager, Stig Andersson, suggested condensing their four first names into a single, catchy acronym, ABBA. It was simple, it was memorable, and it worked. In 1974, ABBA entered the Eurovision Song Contest again, this time with a song called Waterloo. On the 6th of April, in Brighton, England, they won, giving Sweden its first Eurovision victory and instantly propelling the group onto the world stage. What looked to television audiences like overnight success had actually been years in the making, built on failed contests, small club gigs, and the relentless refining that Benny brought to every arrangement. Behind the win in Brighton was a young man who had already spent a decade learning his craft the hard way, one imperfect song at a time. The years that followed turned ABBA into one of the biggest pop acts on the planet. Hits like SOS, Mamma Mia, Fernando, and Dancing Queen carried the group's music into homes across Europe, Australia, and the United States, with Dancing Queen eventually becoming their only #1 single on the American charts. Yet within the band, the dynamic was more complicated than the sunny image on stage suggested. Agnetha and Frida were the faces of the group, drawing the cameras and the headlines with their voices and their looks. Bjorn often stepped forward as the group's spokesman in interviews. Benny, despite writing and shaping nearly every arrangement, tended to remain behind the keyboard, both literally and figuratively, out of the brightest part of the spotlight. It's a dynamic he has spoken about candidly in later interviews, describing a sense of being seen as the technical, almost invisible half of the songwriting team, rather than a star in his own right. That relative anonymity didn't make the work any lighter. Colleagues and biographers have long described Benny as someone who worked with an almost obsessive attention to detail in the studio, reworking chord progressions and arrangements over and over until they matched the emotional tone he was aiming for. Songs that sounded effortlessly upbeat on the radio, like Knowing Me, Knowing You, were often built around melodies that carried real sadness underneath the polish. The Winner Takes It All, released in 1980, is frequently cited by fans and critics as one of the group's most emotionally raw songs, arriving not long after two of the band's members had gone through painful breakups of their own. Because two of the four members of ABBA were also two romantic couples, the group's internal relationships were unusually intertwined with its creative output. Benny and Frida's relationship had begun in 1969, and by 1971, they were living together. In October of 1978, at the height of the band's global fame, they married. From the outside, it looked like a storybook pairing of two of the world's biggest pop stars. Those close to them, however, have described a more complicated reality, with Frida often characterized as emotionally expressive and open, while Benny tended to process difficult feelings quietly, frequently channeling them into music rather than conversation. That contrast, according to people who knew them, put real strain on the marriage over time. By 1980, the relationship had cooled, and in early 1981 they announced their divorce, after roughly 3 years of marriage. Later that same year, Benny married Swedish television presenter Mona Norklet, and the couple went on to have a son, Ludwig, who has since become a producer working on projects connected to his father's legacy, including the ABBA Voyage concert residency. Around the same period, Bjorn and Agnetha's marriage was also unraveling, having ended in divorce in 1979. With two of the four band members going through the end of their marriages within a few years of each other, it's easy to see. In hindsight, why the group's final studio album together, The Visitors, released in 1981, carries a noticeably darker, more mature tone than ABBA's earlier disco-era hits. Songs on that record leaned into themes of separation and disillusionment rather than the celebratory pop that had defined the band's rise. The group continued to work together into 1982, recording a couple of additional tracks, but the collaborative spark that had powered their most productive years had visibly faded. There was no dramatic on-camera breakup or public announcement of a final split. ABBA's last television performance together aired from Stockholm in December of 1982, and after that, the members simply moved on to separate projects, with no formal declaration that the group was finished for good. For Benny, the end of ABBA marked the beginning of a long, quieter chapter. Rather than chase another pop hit, he leaned into projects that let him stretch creatively in different directions. Working again with Bjorn, he co-wrote the music for the concept album and later stage musical Chess, released in 1984, a project that let him explore darker, more theatrical material than anything ABBA had attempted. In the following decade, the two also collaborated on Kristina Fran de Vemela, a Swedish-language musical rooted in historical immigration stories, which became one of the most successful stage productions in Swedish history. These works gave Benny room to write outside the constraints of 3-minute pop singles, and by most accounts, that creative freedom mattered a great deal to him after so many years inside the ABBA machine. Away from the stage, Benny has also been open, later in life, about a long personal struggle with alcohol that ran through much of his adult years, including during ABBA's most successful period. He did not speak publicly about the extent of that struggle until an interview in 2011, by which point he had already been sober for roughly a decade, having stopped drinking around 2001. It's a part of his story that rarely makes it into the retrospectives built purely around ABBA's biggest hits, but it adds an important layer to understanding a man who so often expressed his hardest emotions through music rather than words. As the years passed, Benny kept working steadily rather than resting on ABBA's legacy. He founded Benny Andersson's Orchestra, a band rooted in Swedish folk and Schlager traditions, which went on to have significant success within Sweden. He composed film scores, including music for the Swedish film Palm, which earned him a Guldbaggen Award, one of Sweden's top film honors. He released solo instrumental albums built around accordion and piano, and later recorded a solo piano collection revisiting many of his most famous ABBA melodies stripped down to their simplest form, which offered listeners a chance to hear the emotional architecture of those songs without the studio polish that once surrounded them. Then, in 1999, ABBA's catalog found an entirely new life through Mamma Mia, a stage musical built around the band's songs, which Benny helped shepherd from the West End to Broadway and eventually to 2 feature films. The success of Mamma Mia reintroduced ABBA's music to generations of listeners who had never experienced the band during its original run, and it gave Benny a rare, more visible role as an executive figure behind one of the most successful movie musicals ever made. Decades after ABBA's quiet dissolution, the songs he had once written in relative obscurity were filling arenas and cinemas all over again. The most striking reminder of Benny's staying power came in 2021, when all 4 original members of ABBA reunited to record new material for the first time in nearly 40 years, culminating in the ABBA Voyage Project, a virtual concert residency built around digital avatars of the band performing alongside a live orchestra. For a musician who had spent much of his career working just out of the spotlight, watching his songs reach audiences through cutting-edge technology decades after they were first written offered a rare, full-circle validation of a career built on patience and craft rather than constant visibility. In 2024, all 4 members were formally honored by Sweden's king with one of the country's highest civilian orders, a recognition of just how deeply their music had woven itself into the nation's cultural identity. Looking back across Benny Andersson's career, what stands out is not a single dramatic secret or scandal, but a steady, decades-long pattern of quiet persistence. He was the self-taught kid with an accordion who never had much patience for formal lessons, the teenage father juggling a young family while chasing a music career, the songwriter who kept refining arrangements long after most people would have called them finished, and the band member content to let 2 singers take the spotlight while he shaped the sound from behind the keys. His marriage to Frida, his divorce, his private struggles with alcohol, and his eventual sobriety all sit quietly behind some of the most celebrated pop music ever made. Reminders that even the most joyful-sounding songs can be written by people carrying real, complicated lives. ABBA's music has outlasted trends, outlasted the band's own breakup, and outlasted nearly every prediction about how long a 70s pop group could stay relevant. A large part of that staying power traces back to one unassuming, self-taught musician from Stockholm who spent his life obsessing over the details other people barely noticed, until those details added up to some of the most enduring melodies of the 20th century. Benny Andersson never needed to be the face of ABBA to shape its legacy. He simply needed a piano, a lot of patience, and the freedom to keep chasing the sound in his head until it finally matched what he was feeling. If you enjoyed learning about the real story behind ABBA's music, let us know your favorite Benny Andersson written song in the comments, and subscribe for more deep dives into the lives behind the music you grew up with.